Hi, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. Happy Friday afternoon, in fact, which is great. Today, we're going to look at reaping the benefits of your carbon neutrality transition. So this is going to look at the PAS 2060 carbon neutrality standard, which is, if you like, the old version. And moving that forward to the ISO 14068-1 carbon neutrality standard. So I think this webinar is probably going to take around about maybe 30 minutes or thereabouts, possibly a little bit longer. So we should have plenty time towards then to take any questions that you might have. If you have a look at the little control panel that should be on your screen, you should be able to see a questions box. And if you open that up, you'll be able to type in questions. And then at the end of the session, I will have a look through those questions and hopefully I'll be able to answer those questions at that point. So if you have any questions, don't leave them till the end unless you want to. Type them in as you go and I'll do my best to answer them once I get a chance to look at them at the end. So we'll just start very brief as per usual, introduction to NQA. So NQA is a global certification and verification body. Our business is performing certification and verification audits against a whole variety of different ISO international standards and a few others as well. We have operations all over the world. I'm based in the UK, as you might expect, but I look after the carbon and sustainability services that NQA provide. So I'm Stephen Burt. I'm the Carbon and Sustainability Services Director at NQA. I am also a greenhouse gas verifier myself, so I conduct verifications of our companies against the carbon neutrality standards, amongst other greenhouse gas verification schemes. And I've been with NQA for about 15 years, but overall I've had about 25 years working in carbon and energy and environmental management throughout my career. So what we'll look at today, we'll start off by having a look at the background to the change from the old PAS 2060 carbon neutrality standard to the new international ISO 14068-1 carbon neutrality standard. We'll then have an overview of the key differences between the two. So this is going to get a little technical at times. I'm assuming that if you're on this webinar, you probably have a reasonably good understanding already, certainly of PAS 2060 and greenhouse gas quantification processes. But we're going to have to use a little bit of ISO speak as we go, and I'm going to have to, talk in slightly technical terms. So hopefully everybody will be able to understand as we go. We'll then have a look at a brief overview of the actual structure and the requirements of the new ISO standard as well. And very briefly at the end, we'll be able to have a look at how to manage your transition. So we have lots of existing PAS 2060 clients who we verify each year, and we have lots of new ISO 14068-1 clients who we verify each year. But the reason it's important for the transition is because the PAS 2060 standard will be withdrawn at the end of this year, and those companies currently using PAS 2060 need to think about how to transition over to the new standard. So I'll cover that briefly towards the end as well. So just a little bit of background to the change and why that came about from the old to the new carbon neutrality verification standards. So what is the change? So as I mentioned, PAS 2060, it was produced in 2014. It's a standard for carbon neutrality. It's been replaced by the new international standard. So PAS, publicly available specifications, are produced by BSI in the UK, along with lots of other partners. They apply internationally, but really they're produced in the UK as British standards. The international standard, the ISO standard, has replaced it to reflect that international requirement for such a standard. PAS 2060, and like all PAS standards, it's not really written to ISO standards. So PAS standards are designed to be produced quickly in response to industry needs, whereas ISO standards take years to develop. So that's another reason why it's due to be replaced. The ISO International Standards Organization has caught up and produced an ISO standard that's focused on the same thing, carbon neutrality. It's also a little out of date. So there's a fast moving world in terms of greenhouse gas quantification and verification, and carbon offsetting and carbon removals as well. So, and the drive towards net zero as well. So even since 2014, when PAS 2060 was published, things have changed quite dramatically. So it was important that a new international ISO standard came along as a replacement, and it helps to make carbon neutrality claims much more robust, much more transparent, much more credible. In fact, as robust, transparent and credible as they can be. The ISO standard really is the pinnacle for this. So the new ISO standard was launched in late 2023, so it's still relatively new. PAS 2060, as I mentioned previously, will be withdrawn from use at the end of this year. So we at NQA, as of the 1st of July, have not been taking any new PAS 2060 applications. We're only now accepting applications for the ISO verification, ISO 14068-1. And it's very straightforward. You know, our existing PAS 2060 clients can continue to be verified against PAS 2060 until the end of this year. Next year, the verifications that we undertake will only be for carbon neutrality, will only be to the international standard, the ISO standard itself. So we can look at the key differences between the two standards now. I've tried to tabulate this as best I can, just to help with the understanding of it. So starting at the top, you know, PAS 2060 is a BSI, publicly available specification, whereas the ISO standard is an international standard. The terminology is very similar. It talks about entities and subjects. In other words, you know, which legal entity, the company that wishes to be verified, and the subject of the verification, exactly what is included, what's excluded, what's being looked at. Interestingly, the ISO standard does not mention or use the terms scope 1, 2, and 3. And that's instead it uses the terms direct, energy indirect, and indirect greenhouse gas emission sources as a direct correlation between the terms scope 1, 2, and 3. That's because ISO don't use or don't refer to non-ISO standards, and scope 1, 2, and 3 really exists in the greenhouse gas protocol. But in your heads, just think of them as equivalent to each other. It talks about materiality as well in PAS 2060. Materiality is quite a complex term. You don't really need to worry about that. That's for us as the verifiers to perform materiality assessments when we conduct your verifications. But it's essentially a measure of the scope for error in the calculations, usually plus or minus 5%. PAS 2060 doesn't mention net zero at all. ISO 14068-1 is titled Transition to Net Zero. So it's intended to be a standard that uses carbon neutrality as a mechanism to work towards net zero in the longer term. It is a net zero standard that uses carbon neutrality to get there. And then in terms of the minimum documentation requirements, they're very similar between the two standards. They're just called different things. There's different requirements for what needs to be in there, but essentially the documentation in terms of the scale and the number of documents you need are much the same, really. And then in applicability, PAS 2060 applied to many things, organizations, products, services, things like land use and even running projects, whereas the ISO standard applies to organizations or products only. It's worth pointing out NQA do not have accreditation for the product side of things, but obviously we do have accreditation for the organization side of things. And then the other key differences are around setting your boundary. So for every greenhouse gas quantification process, we need to draw a boundary around exactly what we're looking at in terms of the subject's emissions. and that's for clarity purposes, transparency purposes, so that all organisations have to clearly say what is included and what's not included in the greenhouse gas quantification process. The ISO standard leans on other ISO standards for this. It refers to other ISO standards. So it specifically says that you will set your boundaries, your organizational boundaries or your product boundaries in accordance with the equivalent ISO standard. So we are only interested in organizational boundaries, so company level greenhouse gas quantification. So what the new ISO standard says is you will set your organizational boundaries in accordance with ISO 14064-1, which is a different standard. That's the international standard for greenhouse gas quantification and reporting. It does permit you to use other standards though, but it says if you do use a different standard for setting your boundaries, then it has to be an equivalent to the ISO standard, the ISO 14064 standard. So it references here that you might wish to use the greenhouse gas protocol corporate standard, so long as you follow a life cycle approach, so a cradle to grave greenhouse gas quantification process. In terms of the quantification itself, for actually quantifying the greenhouse gases, same situation, it refers to ISO 14064-1. And if you don't use that, then you have to use something equivalent and justify why you haven't used the ISO standard. And this is good. This is good because ISO 14064 is the international standard, the ISO standard for greenhouse gas quantification. So it just refers to that as the mechanism to use to quantify your greenhouse gas emissions. For products, which I won't cover in a great level of detail, it refers to another standard, ISO 14067, which is the carbon footprint of products standard. It says you must use that. And then in terms of greenhouse gas reporting, so the new ISO standard says you must include all of your direct or scope 1, all of your energy indirect or scope 2 emission sources, and you must include your significant indirect or scope 3 emission sources. It gives you some indication of how you might evaluate which ones are significant and which ones aren't, and therefore which scope 3s or indirect emission sources need to be included or can justifiably be excluded. So if you're doing this in your business, have a careful read of that clause to make sure that you've included everything that you should include. And then the big difference is the hierarchy, the greenhouse gas hierarchy process. So PAS 2060 required us to quantify our greenhouse gas emissions, then to reduce them, then to offset what's left, offset the residual greenhouse gas emissions. ISO 14068 adds in an additional element to that hierarchy. It requires us to quantify our greenhouse gas emissions, then to reduce them, and then to remove and then offset the residual. So I'll explain what that means in a little bit more detail later, but we're talking about greenhouse gas removals here. So mechanisms for removing greenhouse gases directly from the atmosphere. As I say, I'll talk about that in a bit more detail later on because it gets a little bit techy, but I'll do my best to explain it at that point. And then in terms of market versus location-based reporting, so just to explain that, if you are based in the UK and you're connected to the electricity grid, then the electricity should be converted using a location-based approach, in other words, using the standard UK government conversion factor. But if you enter into a, for example, 100% renewable electricity contract with your electricity supplier, then you're able then to report a market-based electricity greenhouse gas emission figure based on the fact that you're procuring 100% renewable electricity, in other words, zero. So PAS 2060 allowed market-based reporting only, in other words, accounting for the type of contract that you have and the renewable component within the electricity supply. ISO 14068 allows that as well, but it also says you must also report your location-based figure alongside. So no major change other than you have to report both location and market-based electricity related greenhouse gas emissions. And then thinking about the carbon credits themselves. So PAS 2060 gave us a lovely little table at the back in Annex C that listed all of the schemes, the carbon crediting programs that is, which are deemed to be compliant with PAS 2060. ISO 14068 doesn't do that. It doesn't give us a nice list of which schemes we should use. Instead, it gives us a list of requirements around the carbon credits themselves and requirements around the carbon crediting program. And that's essentially to make it more robust in terms of the type of carbon credits which are procured. And that's a good thing. However, if you read through the requirements, in actual fact, if you're buying good quality carbon credits, then they'll meet the requirements of ISO 14068 anyway. And then thinking about next about the reductions themselves. So there are some subtle differences here. PAS 2060 in the first year allowed you to quantify your greenhouse gas emissions and offset the lot. ISO 14068 in your first year requires you to make a reduction first. Doesn't say how big that reduction has to be or how you have to achieve that reduction, but there has to be a level of greenhouse gas reduction that takes place in the first year before you're able to go ahead and procure carbon credits. That makes it sound like a barrier. It's actually not. If you think about it, it doesn't say how big the reduction has to be. The intention is that over time, the reductions become greater and therefore the requirement for carbon credits becomes lesser over time. And we're talking timescales up to 2050 here for net zero targeting. It requires, in terms of carbon neutrality pathways and carbon neutrality targets, PAS 2060 required a carbon footprint management plan with targeted reductions in it. The ISO standard's more specific. It requires you to set short-term, medium-term and long-term targets, with the final long-term target aligning yourself with net zero and then planning a pathway to allow you to get to that point. And it also requires a science-based approach, so science-based targets essentially. Which again sounds very complicated, but you can download science-based targeting tool very easily online and plug your numbers in, and it will give you a lovely graph that shows what your pathway needs to be to achieve net zero, and then you can simply build in the carbon neutrality pathway into that. It's relatively straightforward to do. But yeah, the difference is short-term, medium-term and long-term targets, with the final long-term target being a state of net zero for your organization. So hopefully that's given you a nice summary of the differences between PAS 2060 and ISO 14068. In summary, the ISO standard's much stronger, it's much more robust, it's much more credible, it's much more up to date, and it's much more transparent, and therefore it carries a much higher degree of weight in terms of the reputational benefits around going down the path of carbon neutrality as a mechanism to work towards net zero in the longer term. So next we'll have a very brief overview of the structure and the requirements of the ISO standard. I'm not going to go into in loads of detail, but I am going to give you an overview of what each clause requires, because that will just help you to picture in your head what the arrangements that you need to think about, what they might look like. So a good place to start is thinking about what the relationship between ISO 14068-1 and other standards, the relationship. So we've got this lovely complicated looking diagram on the right hand side there, but if you just focus right in on the middle, you can see ISO 14068-1. And then if you look up the way, you'll see that if you're an organization, it requires you to use ISO 14064 to quantify your greenhouse gas emissions. If you're doing it for a product, it requires you to use ISO 14067, carbon footprint of product standard. And then those feed into a greenhouse gas statement, a carbon footprint, which in turn feeds into the center point, which is ISO 14068. And then if you start at the bottom, you don't need to worry about this too much. This is just making sure that the carbon credits that you buy are robust and verified against another standard called ISO 14064-2, which is a project level validation standard for carbon credits themselves. So that's just making sure that the carbon credits you buy are validated to ISO standards and therefore the most robust. And then on the right hand side of the diagram, you don't need to worry about that. That's us, that's NQA. If we come and do a verification of you against ISO 14068, we must follow another ISO standard, which is part of our UCAS accreditation, which is 14064-3, which tells us how we must perform the verification itself. So that's how it fits with the other standards. Not mentioned in that diagram is a new pending standard, ISO 14060, net zero aligned organizations, which will become the ISO international standard for net zero. We expect to see that, I hope, next year, potentially early 2027. But once that's published, that should become the international standard for net zero. And here at NQA, we expect the interest in that to be very high. And then a brief overview of the clauses of ISO 14068. We'll talk about these in a little bit more detail shortly, but essentially starting from the top, it requires you to take a certain approach, make a commitment to carbon neutrality, select the subject and its boundary according to the ISO 14064 standard, quantify your greenhouse gas emissions and removals according to the ISO 14064 standard, and then develop, implement and maintain a carbon neutrality management plan for greenhouse gas emission reductions, offset the carbon footprint, produce a carbon neutrality report, and then finally make a carbon neutrality claim. And that's to be done for each reporting period, which is typically annual. Most companies will follow an annual cycle for greenhouse gas verification, and that should feed back into each year's greenhouse gas quantification process. So if we look through these one by one, briefly, I point out, I'm not going to do it at a huge level of detail, but we'll run through the requirements one by one and just add a little bit more detail to each requirement, just to help you to understand. So clause 4 is the first. Clause 1, 2 and 3 are about scope and normative references and terminology, so we don't need to worry about those too much at the minute. But the first actual requirement in the standard is clause 4, and it presents 11 key principles. And the purpose of those principles is to make sure that when you do your carbon neutrality activities, that it's true and fair, that it's scientifically and technically valid, and it's communicated accurately, and there's nothing that's done in a misleading way. These principles are all about avoiding greenwashing. They're about making sure that what you're doing is done correctly and there's no element of greenwashing about it. Clause 5 is about the approach towards demonstrating carbon neutrality. So earlier on I mentioned the hierarchy, the carbon neutrality hierarchy. So that has to be applied as part of the approach. So that's this idea that you have to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions first, then remove what you can directly from the atmosphere, and I'll explain that in a little bit more detail shortly, and then you're able to offset what's left. And then also the clause 5 requires you to produce a carbon neutrality pathway towards net zero with these short, medium and long-term targets. And as I mentioned previously, the long-term target for most companies is 2050 for net zero. Some companies like NQA, it's earlier, 2040. But that carbon neutrality pathway is intended to have at the start of your journey to net zero using ISO 14068, a higher level of offsetting used initially, and over time a lower level of offsetting and a higher level of greenhouse gas removals, whilst reducing greenhouse gas emissions as you go as well. The standards recognises that you can't reduce greenhouse gas emissions every single year, year on year on year. So it recognises that some years, progress might plateau, some years it might reverse slightly as well, and some years it might improve. But as long as the carbon neutrality pathway is aiming to that ultimate target over a course of many years, up to 25 years towards net zero, then that's all okay. And of course, we've got things like, the UK government at the minute has a commitment to the electricity grid being 100% green by 2035. So 10 years time, their target, the government's target, is that if you draw electricity from the UK grid, it will be 100% renewable. So, the ability to make greenhouse gas reductions year on year is possible as well. NQA, for example, we've grown significantly since 2019, which is our greenhouse gas baseline year. But even though we're a much bigger company than then, our greenhouse gas emissions now are less than 50% what they were in 2019. So it is possible for a company to grow and for you to be able to reduce your greenhouse gas emissions at the same time. Clause 6 is about commitment. This is a straightforward clause. Top management need to commit to carbon neutrality. Usually, I see that, or NQA verifiers see that in the form of some kind of carbon neutrality policy, sometimes integrated with environmental policies or sustainability policies or energy policies. And clause 7 is about the selection of the subject and its boundary. In other words, what is going to be looked at and to what's included in the boundary and to what extent in terms of the greenhouse gas emissions. So that brings us back to the reference to use ISO 14064 for organisations and ISO 14067 for products, or another means which is consistent with these standards, e.g. the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, so long as you apply a life cycle cradle to grave approach when you apply that particular standard. And then clause 8 relates to how to actually go about quantifying the greenhouse gas emissions themselves. This usually results in a greenhouse gas inventory. So more often than not, even with big companies, we see this as a Excel spreadsheet, to be honest, but there's lots and lots of software packages out there that you can buy off the shelf, or even get, if pockets are deep enough, you can get them designed and made bespoke to your own organisation. But often we see a greenhouse gas inventory as a relatively simple Excel spreadsheet that gets produced, detailing and accounting for all the different greenhouse gas emission sources and removals as well, which again, I'll explain that in a second. So the standard, the carbon neutrality standard, again, points us and directs us towards ISO 14064 for organisations and ISO 14067 for products as the means to actually quantify the greenhouse gas emission sources themselves. And that's a good thing as well. Actually, when I think about it, that means that if you go down the road of ISO 14068, you are also assured that the methodology you've used is compliant with ISO 14064. So it's almost like, two standards for the price of one kind of thing. So clause 8 is about quantifying the emission sources and the removals. Clause 9 is about producing a carbon neutrality management plan. This is relatively straightforward to do. This is how you're going to manage things going forward in terms of carbon neutrality, the reductions that you'll make, the offsetting plan that you've got in place, how you will reduce the use of offsetting over time and increase the use of greenhouse gas removals over time. But the clause itself gives us essentially a nice list of the contents that we would want to and need to include in the carbon neutrality management plan itself. And then clause 10 brings us back to managing the greenhouse gas emissions, and it points us back to that hierarchy that comes in time and time again. So at the top of the hierarchy are greenhouse gas reductions, so reducing the greenhouse gas emissions. Next is the greenhouse gas removal. So next in the hierarchy, second choice is the greenhouse gas removal process. So just to dwell on that for a second and explain what that means. So greenhouse gas removal, we can use the definition from the standard itself, from the ISO standard. It says it's the withdrawal of a greenhouse gas from the atmosphere by a greenhouse gas sink. In other words, a mechanism to pull greenhouse gases directly from the atmosphere themselves and store them elsewhere. So examples that are provided in ISO 14068 include reforestation, so tree planting, trees grow, trees absorb carbon dioxide and they store it in their biomass. Carbon sequestration in soils, so there's lots of different chemical and physical processes that can be applied to soils to ensure that they retain the carbon that they've got stored in them, or actually increase the carbon that they've got stored in them as well. Sustainable bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. So this might be biomass plants, you know, the Drax, big power station in England, Drax plant is entirely biomass as well. And also engineering solutions like direct air carbon capture and storage, which are machines which actually suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and they adsorb it and solidify it, and in a, not actually a solid, but they end up being able to be pumped away to storage as well for carbon capture and storage. So the expectation isn't that you as a business start messing about with soil or even planting trees, and certainly not that you as a business go out and buy a direct air carbon capture machine and stick it in your car park. Instead, you can buy into these projects and you can buy credits for other organizations that do plant trees and increase carbon sequestration in soils and do invest in direct air carbon capture machines. So that's what we mean by removal. So that's the second in the hierarchy. And then clause 11 talks about carbon offsetting. So offsetting is last, that's your final choice in the hierarchy. Although, as I mentioned previously, the standard recognises that in the early stages of your ISO 14068 adoption, offsetting is going to be really quite significant. And in the much later stages, as you progress towards net zero, the use of offsetting reduces significantly over time. And clause 11 also lays out in detail the acceptable carbon crediting programs and the acceptable carbon credit types as well. Gives us a list of what checkpoints we need to make against the carbon credits that we procure. And then finally, clause 12 and 13. So clause 12 relates to the carbon neutrality report requirement. And again, really useful. The standard gives us a nice list of the contents that need to be included in the report itself. And then clause 13 covers carbon neutrality claims. So this is when you as an organization make a claim that you're carbon neutral. It requires that it must be based on, the claim this is must be based on, it must reference or even link your carbon neutrality report. So it suggests you might want to make the carbon neutrality report publicly available, or at least an executive summary of the carbon neutrality report has to be published, and that has to be publicly accessible. That's all about transparency, making sure that you publish your claim and it's visible and it's transparent to anybody that's interested in it. And the carbon neutrality claim itself has to be verified. So it has to be verified in accordance with this standard you can see on the screen, ISO 14064-3, which is the standard that we as verifiers work to. It's like a standard that tells us how to do a verification. So our UCAS accreditation covers us in terms of making sure that we operate to that particular standard when we do verifications. So that's the requirements in a very brief nutshell around ISO 14068-1. We can just very quickly look at how to manage your transition. So this is for NQA's existing PAS 2060 clients, or if you use another verification body and you're verified for PAS 2060, how do you transition over to ISO 14068-1? So there's no formal transition process. So this is quite simply because every verification that we do year on year is based on new data. So for example, if we do a carbon verification in 2025, 9 times out of 10 it's 2024's data that we're looking at. And when we repeat the verification in 2026, it's going to be 2025 data. So you're always looking back at a historical period of time for the verification that we do. So unlike ISO 9001 when they publish a new version, or ISO 14001 when they publish a new version, we don't say you've got 3 years to transition from the old to the new standard, which is typical. Instead, you may just have a PAS 2060 verification this year, but next year the verification will be undertaken to the ISO standard. So there's no transition, it's just what, you'll need to move over to the new standard for the next verification that you have the following year. So PAS 2060 will be withdrawn end of the year, as I mentioned. We're no longer, and I don't think anybody is, or they're not permitted to under the accreditations to take any new PAS 2060 applications from the 1st of July this year. So quite simply, if you're a PAS 2060 verified organisation, you'll need to amend and change your documentation and some of your practices in order to be compliant with ISO 14068 for the next time that you have a verification, probably in 2026. So just to summarise the key learnings then, hopefully I've given you a nice idea about the differences between PAS 2060 and ISO 14068, and also the process for transitioning. I use the word transitioning cautionally because it's not a transition, it's a straightforward swap. And hopefully I've also helped you to understand the requirements at a very high level of ISO 14068-1, and also help to emphasize how the new carbon neutrality standard it's really net zero based. It helps to support net zero ambitions. It gets you planning for net zero. It gets you using carbon removals and carbon offsets, to help you to get towards net zero. But the ultimate goal of it is a state of net zero for your organization. So next steps, if you're interested, have a look at our website. There's loads of these webinars that we do as well. There's lots of blogs and podcasts and things that I get involved in. If you need a consultant to help you, we have an associate partner program where we have high quality consultants. We can provide you with 3 names and help you out, or contact us directly. You can contact myself or my colleagues within our sustainability business unit, and we can help you along. And you might also be interested in some of the training that we offer. So NQA Training provide lots of greenhouse gas verification training, from simple, 1-day introductory courses all the way up to sort of 5-day and 4-day lead verifier courses for the greenhouse gas verification standards. And there's contact details if you do need to contact us for anything as well. Good. So that's taken us just 5 minutes longer than I'd expected it to. So if anybody has any questions, I'll be happy to try to answer them. I'll just have a look in the questions box. There are a couple in there. So Greg's asked, do you need ISO 14068 in order? I think probably, Greg, you mean, do you need ISO 14064 in order to achieve ISO 14068? As one's all about demonstrating carbon neutrality, whilst the other is more linked to verifiable claims. I'm not quite sure what you mean. I think 14068 2023 is the same as 14068-1 2023, as far as I'm aware anyway. Does anybody else have any other questions at all? It doesn't look like it, so hopefully that's a good sign that I've managed to answer any questions that you had as we've gone. Okay, well, we can finish up there. Thank you very much, folks. Thanks for taking the time to join us. Hopefully that's been useful, but if there's anything else I can help with, feel free to ask, get in touch, and have a great weekend when it comes. Thanks very much indeed. Bye-bye.